Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
This is Lindsay Smith Rogers. John Green is a New York Times bestselling author and YouTuber. He's known for writing fiction about teenagers, relationships, and poetry, but his latest book is about tuberculosis. In this episode, we talk about why the topic of TB and how the disease and its prevalence reflects so much back on us in terms of who we are as a society. Let's listen. John Green, thank you so much for joining us on Public Health on Call. How are you today?
I'm okay. Thanks for having me. It's been a long couple weeks when it comes to foreign aid for the stuff that I care about a lot, like tuberculosis, and especially devastating last week. But personally, I'm doing great.
Well, that's a mixed bag to hear, but we're going to talk about your new book today, Everything is Tuberculosis, which is fantastic.
Thank you.
Millions of people have read your books. They've been developed into popular movies of all the topics in the world that you could write about, and you've kind of prefaced here for me. Why tuberculosis?
I had no idea, if you told me 5 years ago I was going to write a book about tuberculosis, I would have been duly astonished. But I didn't know that tuberculosis was still the world's deadliest infectious disease. I didn't know anything about TB until I visited a TB hospital in Sierra Leone in 2019, met a young man there named Henry who shares a name with my son. And after meeting Henry and following his story of trying to survive drug-resistant tuberculosis, I felt like this was the story I had to tell. So I'm still writing about smart young people who love poetry. It's just now I'm writing a true story about a real one.
And you also say in your book that you're not a medical historian, but this book is a little bit of medical history too.
Yeah, a little bit, but I definitely don't want to claim that title. I don't have the degrees to back it up, but I became obsessed and fell very far down the rabbit hole over the last 5 years, and I've been lucky to be able to work closely with a lot of historians and experts in the field and learn from them.
I found it really interesting that you have managed to find a tie-in for tuberculosis for a lot of the major historical events that we know of. Do you want to talk about one of those real quick?
Sure, yeah. I mean, from the Industrial Revolution to World War I, TB has been everywhere. I argue in the book that TB should be listed as a minor cause of World War I, since all three of the boys from Belgrade who participated in the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand were dying of tuberculosis and knew they were dying. And part of the reason they agreed to be part of this assassination plot was because they felt that they wanted their lives to have been for something.
One of the things that you talk about with TB is, it's preventable, it's curable, it's still a major burden, and that's a huge problem.
Yeah, it really represents a failure, I think, of our resource distribution systems, that we've known how to cure TB for 75 years now, and yet we still allow over 1 million people to die every year of the disease. This is, I think, ultimately the reason I wanted to write about TB is because it's a way into writing about how do we live in this world? How do we live in a world of such profound inequity, and how might we choose a different world?
In public health, we know it can be really hard to talk about prevention rather than cure. How is that part of the problem here?
It's a huge part of the problem. I mean, TB is preventable on a few levels, right? Like if we just reduce the number of people who are suffering from malnutrition, we also reduce the burden of active tuberculosis, because that's a huge risk factor. But it's also a huge problem because people like interventions. They like the story, right? Like nobody ever talks about the fact that clean water has saved more lives than any medicine ever invented, or the fact that, public health interventions tend to be invisible. And a lot of times the people working in public health, I know it must be very frustrating for them to have their work be, well, this didn't happen. We didn't have an outbreak of Marburg disease. We didn't have an outbreak of bird flu because we made smart public health interventions and we made smart investments in public health. And that saved many millions of lives, but we don't think about that as saving many millions of lives because we think about how it never happened. With TB in particular, there's two kinds of prevention. There's making sure that the disease never happens, which is by limiting outbreaks, by contact tracing, by doing active case finding. And then there's preventative therapy, which is incredibly effective at preventing the emergence of TB in close contacts of people who've been sick. And we have these wonderful tools, but unfortunately, we just don't use them enough.
Yeah, and one of the things you talk about in your book is there's almost like a scaremongering tactic here when you talk about things like superbugs. Like
Yeah.
that's a way to get people really engaged in this conversation, is to say like it's drug-resistant TB, and you say that, this is how you get this on wealthy people's doorsteps.
Yeah, I struggle with this a lot. Like, do we scaremonger and tell people, which is true, that there could be a totally resistant form of tuberculosis that emerges, especially I think it's much more likely to emerge now than it has been at any point in the last few decades. And that would be a catastrophe. While at the same time wanting to balance, like, yes, this could come to your doorstep. Yes, we have 10,000 cases of active TB in the US every year. But at the same time, that shouldn't be why we care about TB. We should care about TB because 10 million people are getting sick with it every year, and it's the deadliest infectious disease in the world, and we know how to make it not the deadliest infectious disease in the world, and we're just not doing that.
Yeah, this is really a failure of our collective ability to solve a problem.
Yeah.
But there's not a lot of talk about collective ability to solve a lot of things right now. So what is the path for this happening? Like, you can sell a story to us. What's the story here?
Well, I have to confess, while I am a hopeful person and sort of a hard-headed optimist, I am feeling a little bit discouraged at the moment because I think we're taking many steps backwards when it comes to addressing the TB crisis, increasing drug resistance, increasing the risk of all kinds of catastrophe down the road when it comes to TB. But the path is a fairly straightforward one. It's not that dissimilar to how we eliminated TB or dramatically reduced the burden of TB in Alaska in the 1950s and 60s. You do active case finding, which means in Alaska, that meant sending out vans all over the state that had mobile x-ray machines inside of them, making x-rays freely available. And then you treat every person you identify who has tuberculosis, and you offer preventative therapy to their close contacts. And that ends the chain of transmission. And if we did this at scale, we know we can do it. We've done it in all kinds of places around the world, which is why in much of the world TB isn't as big a public health issue as it used to be. We know that we can do this, and we know that the benefits of it would be extraordinary. It saves a lot of money. We spend a lot less money on tuberculosis in the United States than we used to. When my great-uncle died of TB in 1930, there were almost as many hospital beds for TB patients as there were for all other illnesses combined. And now, of course, we spend much less on TB. Less than we should, actually, but we spend much less than we used to because we don't have to spend as much. And those are the kind of long-term, open-ended investments that we need to make to reduce the burden of disease, which is a great investment overall. I don't have to say this to public health professionals, they already know, but it's very frustrating to see us underinvesting in these places that are so key to human health.
Yeah, and I think to your point, like, this is very resource-heavy work. Like, the traditional public health, boots-on-the-ground work requires a lot of expertise, a lot of people. We had an episode recently with a TB expert about what's been happening in Kansas City, and he said this is the canary in the coal mine, that the system is not working in the U.S. So this is closer than we think it is.
Yeah, the system is not working as well in the U.S. as it needs to because it's such chronically underfunded and under-resourced. And people don't think about TB. So we end up diagnosing cases very late, in some cases too late for the person to survive. So I think the canary in the coal mine is a very good metaphor. What we're seeing in Kansas could very well be the beginning of a much larger story of tuberculosis in the U.S. We've seen cases go up for the last several years, which is scary on its own. But underinvesting in public health, we know from history, leads to the outbreaks of infectious disease.
And it's not just underinvestment in public health. I want to quote your book here. The disease has used social forces and prejudice to thrive wherever power systems devalue human lives. Like, this is not just a matter of underfunding certain systems. There is a value statement here, too. There's a morality statement.
Absolutely. When we don't value all human lives equally, this is the world we end up with, a world where our deadliest infection is one that we know how to cure.
I want to thank you, by the way, not just for writing a book about tuberculosis, but really for writing a book about public health at a time when public health is kind of being put through the ringer. And I want to ask you, do you have any words of encouragement for people that are working in public health right now?
It's hard, and I'm sorry that it's so hard. I really am. I'm friends with the lead TB a prevention officer here in Indiana and with lots of public health folks around the world. And I know it's really hard. I have a habit of believing that I live at the end of history because today is the last day that I've experienced, the most recent day that I've experienced. I don't know what the future looks like. And so today always feels like the end of the story to me because it's the end of the story that I know or am experiencing, but it's not the end of the story. Of course, we live in the middle of history. This is not the first time when we've experienced a setback, significant setbacks when it comes to being able to address health crises in our communities. We are in the middle of the story and we must fight for a happier ending to the story.
I really appreciate that. You've written this book. You're out there talking about it. The timing could not be better in some ways. What's next?
Or worse in others.
Or worse than others, sure. But, we need you, John Green. Like, what's next?
Well, I mean, this is the start of my TB work, not the end of it. This is the work of my life now and work I'm very grateful to have. And what's next for me, hopefully I'll continue to write. I'd love to write another novel down the road and write more books and everything. But I'm really grateful that this gets to be a big part of my life and that, trying to advocate on behalf of TB survivors and lift up their voices and their stories is really important work for me.
Tell us how Henry's doing now.
Henry's doing really well. I should say that Henry is doing well, but also imperiled by some of the decisions that have been made to take away funding for USAID. And so he's a college student. He's a junior in college at the University of Sierra Leone. He's studying human resources and management, and a very good student and just the best. He and I talk all the time and he's the best. But he still lives a life that has a lot of fragility to it and a lot of uncertainty to it. And it's been really hard. He and I had a conversation recently where he said, I'm concerned about being able to get this medication because it comes through the U.S. government. And I said, well, we'll make sure that you can get that, Henry, like you and your family can get that. And he said, thank you, but what about everyone else? And that's the truth of public health, is that individuals can't do this. None of us can do this alone. We have to think about everyone. We have to think about everyone else. And it really breaks my heart to be in this situation.
I think what about everyone else could be the tagline maybe for public health.
Yeah, exactly.
There you go. We needed a slogan to get behind. Now we have one, thanks to Henry.
Yeah.
Yeah, I saw that you'd posted, I think on YouTube or Instagram the other day, where it was just like warehouses of all of this medication that's already been paid for that can't be distributed out in the world.
Yeah, because of stop work orders.
Yeah, this is a hard world to live in.
It is. It's really, really hard. And I feel like the work of public health professionals is not just under-resourced, it's also undervalued. And to have people trying to undermine the really critical work that public health people are doing is it's hard to watch from afar. I can only imagine how hard it is to live on the inside of it.
Well, and this is why we so appreciate people like you that are taking up the mantle of this, that are writing these stories, that are telling the stories of these survivors and people. So thank you so much for everything that you do, John Green.
Thank you, Lindsay.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith Rogers, Stephanie Desmond, and Grace Fernandez-Cesiri. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Michael Bonfils, Spencer Greer, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production coordination by Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Fernandez-Cesiri. Analytics by Elisa Rosen. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.